Hello everyone. Hi Gaurav. Hi Rajesh. How are you? Welcome, welcome.
Hey, hi Kunal.
Hello, hello. All right, I'm going to record this webinar. It's going to be a small group today, and we're going to record it and send it out to others. All right, it's 9 a.m. so Pacific, so I think it's a good time to get started. So, yeah, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. As you all know, my name is Kunal. I am the CEO at Certivo, and today's session is really designed to give everyone the most complete and practical training on navigating PFAS compliance for 2025 and beyond. We're going to cover the foundations of PFAS regulations. We're going to cover the global regulatory environment, critical state-by-state updates. We're going to cover how PFAS compliance risks your supply chain and business. Also cover strategies for turning compliance into a burden from a burden that it is today into a competitive advantage. So let's just dive straight in. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We're going to start with a strong foundation. We're going to understand what PFAS are and why regulators are focused on them. Then we're going to deep dive into the upcoming regulatory requirements across the United States, Europe, and beyond. We're also going to cover business risks, practical strategies, real-world examples to help you benchmark your own progress. And then, we'll also share a little bit about Certivo and, the company and how we can help you navigate this landscape. And we'll certainly leave plenty of time for any questions that people might have. So let's start with the basics that we all care about. What are PFAS? PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a large family of human-made chemicals used for their incredible durability. PFAS are highly resistant to water, oils, stains, heat, and even chemical breakdown. That made them ideal for products like non-stick pans, waterproof clothing, and industrial equipment, starting in the 1940s. But what made PFAS really useful was their incredible persistence. And it's exactly what also made them very dangerous. So once PFAS are released in the environment, they don't naturally degrade. They essentially last forever. And that's why they're called forever chemicals. So the question I think we should all be asking ourselves is like, why is there so much regulatory attention on PFAS today? And the simple answer is that these chemicals accumulate. They accumulate in people, in animals, in the environment. In fact, the CDC has found that PFAS are in the bloodstream of 97% of Americans. And even small amounts of exposure over time have been linked to serious health effects, including cancer, immune system damage, liver disease, developmental problems. So their persistence and toxicity has just created not just some sort of environmental crisis, but it's like a public health crisis at some level. And so governments essentially across the world are saying, look, we've got to take some action against PFAS as a whole. And they're not just isolated to chemical parts or chemical plants rather. They're woven into our daily life, and especially into the complex manufacturing supply chains. Consumer goods like non-stick pans, waterproof jackets, stain-proof carpets, and even cosmetics can contain PFAS. In industrial sectors like semiconductors, automotive, aerospace, medical devices use PFAS for coatings, membranes, and chemical treatments. Even recycled plastics and textiles can introduce PFAS contamination back into manufacturing, creating these hidden compliance risks. So they sort of are in the supply chain. That's where they essentially come from. Historically, most attention has been focused on two PFAS substances, PFOA and PFOS. And these were the first targets for regulatory bans and phase outs in the early 2000s. Since then, manufacturers have also introduced short chain PFAS and newer substitutes like Genex chemicals. New research has shown that these alternatives will pose serious environmental and health risks. So that's why regulatory agencies like the EPA and the European Chemicals Agency are now proposing class-based restrictions, treating all PFAS chemicals as a group, not just regulating individual substances one by one. And this is sort of a major shift that has happened. It means companies must prepare for broad, sweeping compliance obligations that governments put on them. The next bigger question that we should all ask is, how do these PFAS sneak into our products in general? And understanding that is very, very critical. So there are three main pathways that manufacturers face. One is, of course, direct use. PFAS, can be added intentionally into materials, coatings, adhesives, lubricants, treatments. Second is indirect contamination. They could come from process aids, cleaning agents, recycled feedstocks, and recycled feedstocks used upstream. Or it could just be through cross contamination. When PFAS enters through your supplier's supplier without clear tracking or visibility. So you may, as a manufacturer, not just use PFAS yourselves, but your supply chain in this indirect contamination or this cross contamination, where you may not have the knowledge of, might just be a way where it sneaks into your supply chain. So let's talk first about direct use. PFAS are used for surface treatments, making textiles waterproof or electronics resistant to heat and corrosion. They could show up in industrial lubricants, mold release agents for plastics and rubbers, and protective membranes in filtration systems. They can also be found in wire insulation, gaskets, seals, particularly in products using fluoropolymer-based materials like PTFE. The key takeaway really here is that PFAS may be baked into your products intentionally at multiple levels, from fabrics to components to coatings. The second, which is the more dangerous option, is really this risk in indirect contamination. So, we may not add PFAS ourselves, but if your supplier uses some sort of recycled plastics contaminated with PFAS, it could end up in your product. If adhesive, inks, printing materials contain PFAS, your final assembly might be exposed. If cleaning or surface preparation chemicals used during manufacturing are PFAS-based, residues can remain on parts. So this is why companies are knowingly becoming non-compliant, despite good intentions. Again, it's this indirect contamination, which is really the cause for most of where manufacturers sort of struggle to get their story together. So let me give you a real world example. A tier one manufacturer of automotive electronics sourced a component that passed all material compliance checks at the direct supplier level. But after a product recall investigation, it was discovered that a tier three supplier used PFAS coating, process chemicals, never declared it to tier two, never declared it to tier one. The company essentially had to initiate costly recalls, scramble to update customer certifications, and suffered brand reputation damage. So here's an example of you're deep up into the supply chain. It's somewhere down at that tier three level that had used some sort of PFAS containing process chemicals. And so the big picture key takeaway here is, look, your PFAS compliance risk isn't just your tier one suppliers, it runs through your entire supplier ecosystem. And so visibility beyond tier one is also now becoming mission critical. And the more complex your product, the higher the PFAS risk. If you have 500 suppliers, like many of us, or at least at Certivo, a lot of our clients are, and in that range of having 500 plus suppliers, more than 10,000 parts, and each part has an average of like 3 subcomponents, you're essentially managing supply chain PFAS exposure across tens and thousands of individual materials. Multiply that by multiple tiers where disclosures are patchy, non-existent, and you quickly see that the scale of the challenge, right? And remember, regulatory obligations like the EPA's TISCA rule apply even if you didn't know about PFAS presence. Ignorance is not a defense anymore. Visibility is mandatory. That's what the EPA has essentially has said. It's like, you can't just claim ignorance, I did not know. PFAS regulations are also no longer isolated to the United States and Europe. They are truly a global phenomenon. Today, regulators across North America, Europe, Asia Pacific are introducing or accelerating restrictions on PFAS. And manufacturers must essentially prepare for what we call multi-jurisdictional compliance. It's not just local rules. We all live in a global world. Our supply chain is essentially global. It's rare to see a manufacturer only buy parts from a local jurisdiction. It's likely they're doing that globally. And so this is really a multi-jurisdictional compliance issue, not just some sort of local rules that we have to adhere by. In the US, federal action, of course, as most of you know, is led by the EPA. The TSCA PFAS reporting rule requires all manufacturers and importers to essentially disclose PFAS usage dating back to 2011. There's a law called this CLA Superfund law that designates certain PFAS as hazardous substances, exposing companies to essentially an environmental cleanup liability. States like California, Minnesota, Maine are enacting their own PFAS bans as well, sometimes stricter than the federal requirements. And the FDA is also investigating PFAS migration from food packaging. So essentially, the message is clear. Look, PFAS management is now a front and center compliance priority in the US, period. Let's talk a little bit about TSCA in this next section. At the high level, there's no minimum threshold. Even trace PFAS must be reported. Articles, meaning finished products, are included, not just raw chemicals. Companies must disclose usage going all the way back to 2011. Reporting begins in July 2025 and is due in January 2026. The burden of proof is on manufacturers and their importers, not on the EPA. So that's something for us all to know about when it comes to TSCA. Essentially, timelines coming, everyone's scrambling to make sure that they can start, getting ready for this July 2025 deadline, and then, January 2026 as well. The European Union is proposing the most aggressive PFAS regulation in the world. In Europe, in general, we've seen regulations a lot more stricter. And under the REACH regulation, the EU is considering a full class ban on over 10,000 PFAS substances. So this would impact, manufacturing inputs, consumer goods, food packaging, medical devices, industrial equipment. And a final decision is expected sometime in 2025. And if enacted, the EU will probably become the world's strictest, PFAS regulatory zone. So, we all have to keep an eye out on this as well and what's happening in the EU. But at least we now know, like we saw on the last slide, which, when it comes to, at least the TSCA year, we have at least some sense of, when the portal will open July 2025 and deadlines of 2026. So if you're selling into the EU, we should all be prepared for one, broad definitions that capture many fluorinated materials, not just traditional PFAS. Again, it's a little fuzzy in terms of, the definitions. Staggered phase outs, some materials banned within 18 months, others phased out over longer periods. Mandatory PFAS disclosures on products and supply chains. Due diligence requirements to ensure suppliers are compliant. Manufacturers without strong compliance systems, in my view, are going to struggle to maintain EU market access. So getting your act together when it comes to, just managing all your products, your parts, etc., is going to be, very, very important at this stage as you prepare for some of these upcoming deadlines. Canada is also moving aggressively under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA. Companies must report PFAS content in imported products by January 2025. That's already started. I'm sure a lot of you here have already been dealing with this so far. So I know there was, at least with some of our clients as well, a big rush earlier this year to sort of get through some of their deadlines. I think there's also some sort of extension that you can file for, and many of them did that as well. Canada has already issued some of the world's strictest drinking water standards for PFAS, as low as 30 nanograms per liter. And like the EU, Canada is signaling a move towards full class-based restrictions rather than regulating one chemical at a time. So this North American compliance burden in general is rising. And in my view, it's on both sides of the border, both on, up there in the north as well as here in the United States. Let's talk about Australia. Australia has implemented national level bans on PFAS containing firefighting foams. It has also strengthened import restrictions on certain PFAS containing chemical substances. Through the national PFAS ban, essentially Australia is coordinating environmental cleanups, product restrictions, and research funding. So essentially, if you export to or you source from Australia, new compliance documentation may already be required. So just something, again, to check into as it comes to Australia very specifically. Then let's go into Asia Pacific. Japan is issuing industrial standards for monitoring PFAS usage. South Korea has initiated, national environmental monitoring programs. China is conducting early stage studies right now to evaluate, regulate PFAS emissions and use. So while less mature than the EU or the US efforts, today these APAC markets are also clearly moving towards stronger PFAS control regimes. So these are things that we have to keep an eye out for as well. Of course, I know, the focus is on the EU and the US, much more mature, a lot more regulatory sort of maturity there. But all these other global countries are also, announcing or will be announcing a lot more soon. So something for us to all keep an eye out for. One of the biggest global shifts is regulatory agencies moving away from these single chemical bans and instead banning or restricting entire PFAS classes. So if one PFAS is found to be harmful, structurally similar PFASs are treated the same way. So sort of, the structure of PFAS, put them all into a single group and say, look, this entire group is essentially banned right now. So what this does is essentially it increases dramatically the number of the substances that are covered, and it dramatically expands compliance challenges. So like I said, it's not just a single ban now, it's the entire group. So you've got to keep track of that big list. The big takeaway for manufacturers, in my view, is very simple. PFAS compliance is no longer localized. It's global, it's complex, it's accelerating. Companies that operate internationally must prepare for one, multi-jurisdictional compliance, like we've talked about, a full supply chain traceability, a faster phase-out expectations, higher customer and investor scrutiny, and compliance, again, isn't just optional anymore. It's a requirement for survival and certainly, for growth. I know, again, in my world, in Certivo, there's just been lots of clients this year very specifically trying to sort of, rush to get a lot of their PFAS story, in order, just because, of all these upcoming deadlines and all the attention that's happening on PFAS these days. Let's dive a little more into TSCA, because, this obviously applies to the US. The Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, is the primary US law essentially governing the regulation of chemicals. TSCA gives the EPA broad authority to essentially regulate chemical manufacturing and imports, require reporting and record keeping, restrict or ban dangerous substances. And the 2016 amendments, known as the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, essentially strengthened TSCA dramatically, making it easier for the EPA to demand industry-wide reporting. So today, TSCA is the core mechanism driving PFAS disclosure requirements across the US manufacturers and importers. And let's walk through how PFAS became such a high priority target under TSCA. In 2010, what happened was the EPA launched voluntary phase outs for key PFAS like the PFOAs and PFOSs. By 2015, major US manufacturers essentially phased them out. But environmental contamination was quite widespread at that time. So what the EPA did was in 2019, they announced what they call the PFAS Action Plan, calling for stronger mandatory reporting requirements. And that led to the finalizations of the TISCA PFAS reporting rule in late 2023 for mandatory compliance timelines now set for 2025 and 2026 that we talked about. So who must report, under TISCA? Under the TISCA rule, the reporting obligation falls on, manufacturers, including those making finished articles, not just chemicals, importers, including importers of finished goods containing PFAS, any company that manufactured or imported PFAS or products containing PFAS between January 1, 2011 and January 31st, 2022. So unlike some other EPA rules, there are really no exemptions based on company size for large manufacturers. If you fall within the scope, you must report. And, it's sort of one of those like better be safe than sorry approaches. So, that's what I would at least recommend to manufacturers out there. Many companies also mistakenly believe that TISCA only applies to chemicals or raw materials. And I think that's the big thing that one has to sort of, get their mind and wrapped around. That's certainly not the case. Articles, meaning finished products, are explicitly included. If you manufacture or import, automotive parts, circuit boards, sensors, batteries, gaskets, industrial coatings, clothing, and any of those contain PFAS, you're essentially covered by this rule. So the bottom line is, look, if PFAS is anywhere in your products, even buried deep in some layer, you essentially must report. So, that is, I think, an important consideration here. So what information must be reported? Your reporting requirements are detailed and technical. You must report the identity of the PFAS chemical, including your CAS number and structure, volume manufactured, imported, uses, whether commercial, consumer, industrial, any byproducts generated during production, information on exposure, environmental and worker, disposal methods used, and reporting. One thing to remember is, this reporting obligation applies retroactively to 11 years of history. So it's not just, what I'm doing today, for example. So it has to be retroactively, reported. Just something for everyone to, pay attention to. So let's review some key deadlines. Again, on this side, rule became effective November 13th, 2023. EPA reporting portal opens July 11th, 2025, this year, coming soon. For most companies, final PFAS submissions are due January 11th, 2026. So, planned this year going into January. And small manufacturers, especially defined by the EPA, have until July 11th, 2026. So there is a small manufacturer exemption of sorts where you get some extra time going into July of next year. But I think the big picture again is like, make no mistake, the point is we got to all start preparing now to meet these timelines because the July 11th is going to come soon. You've got to wrap it up by January 11th, 26, and then there's some exemption for the small manufacturers going into July 11th, 2026. Unlike some other chemical regulations, there is no de minimis threshold under TISCA PFAS reporting. Even trace amounts of PFAS measured in parts per billion must be disclosed. If PFAS are present, period, you must report. There is no materiality test. There's no volume threshold. This makes supply chain visibility again very, very absolutely essential when it comes to PFAS as a whole. And the cost of non-compliance is something that we also should talk about. What happens if you don't comply? The EPA can impose fines of over $50,000 per violation per day. That's pretty crazy, in my view. Non-compliant products can be recalled, blocked from import. Companies can face civil or even criminal penalties. The EPA has already declared PFAS an enforcement priority for 2025 and beyond. So waiting to act or assuming you won't be audited is a dangerous strategy, in my opinion. Action is required now. So while the EPA governs chemicals nationally, individual states are acting much faster and often more aggressively on PFAS. So states like California, Maine, and Minnesota are setting stricter limits sooner and covering more product categories. If you sell products across multiple states, so now you must manage a patchwork of requirements or risk fines, recalls, or restricted market access. So let's walk through in this next section the key states that we all need to know, as it relates to some of these deadlines. Well, California leads the pack here and they lead in the US in general on environmental regulations, and PFAS is no exception. Starting January 2025, essentially California banned textiles with a PFAS content greater than 100 parts per million. By 2027, the limit is going to drop to 50 parts per million. And affected products include apparel, rugs, upholstery, outdoor gear. Manufacturers must also provide a certificate of compliance to customers upon request, verifying that that their products meet that standard. So that's, I think, one thing that I think a lot of folks on this call, but also in general, are used to. But again, this is just one of those, like, hey, certificates of compliance has to be provided. Colorado has also taken some aggressive action. As of January 1, 2024, fabric treatments using PFAS are banned. That was the date when these things started. Indoor textile furnishing with PFAS essentially banned starting January 1st, 2025. And then by 2027, the ban expands to outdoor products as well. So manufacturers and distributors, again, if you're targeting the Colorado market, you must adapt pretty quickly as well, especially now that 2025 sort of deadline is already passed. Maine is the next one. They've taken the broadest PFAS ban in the United States. By 2026, textiles containing intentionally added PFAS essentially will be banned. By 2032, all products containing intentionally added PFAS will be banned, unless the use is classified as currently unavoidable. So companies must also submit detailed PFAS reports to the state starting 2025, which we are already in. And then for manufacturers, I think Maine at some level represents the strictest end of the regulatory spectrum, just because of the broadest sort of definition of PFAS here. Minnesota is next. They've got something what they call as a two-phase or two-stage PFAS program, essentially. Again, as of January 1, 2025, consumer products containing intentionally added PFAS banned. Starting January 1st, 2026, the companies must submit detailed PFAS disclosure reports for any products containing PFAS. And product categories include cookware, cosmetics, children's products, and textiles. New York is next. New York has already banned intentionally added PFAS in paper-based food packaging. This, in fact, started in January 1st, 2023. And this move mirrors similar bans in California and Washington as well. Essentially, manufacturers of packaging materials and food service products must comply now. Washington has something known as the Safer Products for Washington program, which included phased PFAS restrictions across multiple industries. Targeted product areas include firefighting gear, cookware, cleaning products, and automotive supplies. Further expansions are expected going into 2025 and beyond. So again, one of those cases where we just have to keep monitoring and make sure that nothing props up essentially that folks are missing. Other states to watch out for: Vermont and Connecticut are also moving forward with PFAS restrictions. Vermont has essentially banned PFAS in cosmetics and firefighting foams. Connecticut has convened a PFAS task force of sorts and plans new product restrictions. Many states are working through coalitions, sharing best practices to expand PFAS regulation. So, it's not just the regular states like, California, Maine, etc. There are others also that are moving, pretty fast when it comes to their PFAS restrictions. So here's a quick sort of summary, side-by-side comparison to help us visualize the differences. Each state has its own timeline, scope, compliance requirements. So it's making it essential for us to manage compliance systematically. It's not just the EPA that we have to worry about, the federal requirements, but every state requirements as well. So tracking at both the state level as well as the federal level is going to be important. And yeah, for everyone on the call, as well as those, doing this recording, I'll send you all these slides, separately. So you have all this, with you. So don't worry about taking notes. And the video is recorded as well. So you have access to this. In my view, managing PFAS compliance across multiple states is now one of the biggest regulatory risks manufacturers face. Different deadlines, different product scopes, different reporting expectations. And, in my view, static spreadsheets, decentralized systems simply won't scale. Dynamic real-time compliance management is essential. This also, is only PFAS, but imagine all the other regulatory requirements that one has to also keep track of. Like they all sort of just add on to the management of compliance across your entire supply chain. So let's start again with a real world example. You're a major consumer goods brand, a household name in outdoor apparel. You faced a major compliance crisis when PFAS were detected in your waterproof jackets. California's new limits triggered immediate market withdrawal. Pretty bad. Facing regulatory pressure and mounting public scrutiny, the company issued, a voluntary recall, costing them over $20 million, not including any future lost sales. Brand reputation took a major hit, especially among environmentally conscious consumers. So this is just, although it might sound like a hypothetical example, this is what companies can be exposed to. It's the kind of risk that you're exposed to essentially when it comes to, PFAS. These governments are extremely, extremely strict when it comes to enforcing some of these PFAS bans. Another case, you're an electronics importer, you're sourcing circuit boards from Asia. Boards were coated with PFAS-based conformal coatings. Company failed to report PFAS presence under TISCA. EPA import audit flagged the non-compliance, leading to a $1.2 million settlement. Even worse, the importer had to delist its key suppliers and scramble for replacements, causing months of supply chain disruption. So, big picture, again, hate to sound the alarm, but as a manufacturer, you're responsible for supplier PFAS compliance, period, whether you know it or not. And where the trigger can come from is something that we all might be unaware of. So being able to manage this entire process is very important. But it's not all bad news. Let's take a positive example as well. You're a mid-sized industrial manufacturer launching a PFAS compliance initiatives. You were proactive. You started 18 months early. They built out a full BOM and supply inventory focused on PFAS risk, automated supplier outreach, COC collection, prepared complete discard reporting files ahead of schedule. The result, they passed multiple customer audits with zero issues, secured new OEM contracts specifically because of their compliance readiness. Essentially, the early movers are turning compliance into a market advantage. Sabrina is on the call. She's one of our customers from Hensler, and they've proactively sort of working with Certivo and making sure that they get all their certificates, etc., on file very quickly. Lessons learned, what these case studies teach us. One is assume PFAS risk exists unless proven otherwise. Full supply chain visibility is important, not just tier one. That's critical. Manual compliance methods, spreadsheets, emails are 100% going to fail at scale. Every supplier engagement helps avoid any downstream crisis. And finally, not knowing about PFAS in your supply chain is not a defense under laws like TISCA. Companies that are proactive, not reactive, essentially, will win. Okay, we'll skip this slide. We're small groups. I don't know if it makes sense to do a full sort of audience poll here, but but let's sort of move ahead. Okay, so let's talk about financial risk. Under TISCA, EPA fines can reach over $50,000 dollars per violation per day. I think I mentioned this. And cumulative penalties can even cross, seven figures. If your product must be recalled due to PFAS violations, the average major recall costs, over $1 million, often much more for brand name goods. The brand reputation, I think, becomes more critical because you tend to lose customer contracts. The brand in the market essentially is destroyed. It's very hard to put a number on that brand. You may face costs to destroy non-compliant inventory, refund customers, replace parts. PFAS-related lawsuits are accelerating, with class actions targeting manufacturers who fail to disclose PFAS content. And insurance carriers are beginning to raise premiums or exclude PFAS liabilities from coverage. So the financial costs are real, they're substantial, they're growing. There's market access risk, and beyond the fines, that's obviously bigger and more faster. States like California, Maine, Minnesota are banning entire categories of products containing PFAS, like we talked about. The EU is moving towards class-wide bans under REACH. Large OEMs in industries like automotive, electronics, aerospace are essentially demanding PFAS-free declarations from suppliers. So if you can't prove compliance, you risk being cut from supplier lists or losing contract bids. Non-compliance doesn't just create regulatory penalties, it destroys revenue opportunities, in my view. And finally, your brand, like we talked about, your reputation and your ESG ratings are essentially at stake. Investors are increasingly asking about PFAS exposure under ESG. It stands for environmental, social governance, all those different frameworks. NGOs and journalists are actively investigating and exposing brands associated with PFAS-related harm. Consumers, especially younger demographics, I'm seeing that, with a lot of folks in my family as well, my nephews, nieces. They expect safe, sustainable, transparent supply chains. Consumers are becoming very environmentally friendly, conscious. And once your brand is linked to PFAS contamination, the reputation damage is so lasting and it's difficult to repair, right, as you can imagine. And so it's not just an operational issue at some level, it's a C-suite priority now. A lot of our clients, again, you're at Certivo, a lot of these initiatives are driven from the top. It's at the board level, it's at the C-suite level, it's at the VP of operations level. It's because, they can't risk some of these reputational risks that could come, or the, issues that could come with just not being able to prove PFAS compliance. So let's talk about why PFAS compliance is also so difficult in practice. One is most manufacturers have multi-tiered supply chains. I think we all know that by now, meaning your direct supplier might source from 3 or 4 additional layers before reaching raw materials. Second, many suppliers, especially outside the US and the EU, are unaware that PFAS regulations even apply to their components or processes. Third, legacy parts produced, and designed years ago often have incomplete or missing material disclosures. And fourth, even when suppliers do respond, the data often arrives in non-standard formats, it arrives in spreadsheets, PDFs, emails, making all that aggregation and analysis very, very chaotic. So without structured supplier data, compliance reporting is nearly impossible if you can imagine at scale. Like imagine, again, you're dealing with 500 suppliers. Imagine you're dealing with thousands of parts. Imagine you're tracking all the statewide regulations. Imagine you're tracking the federal regulations. Imagine you're trying to collect all that data from suppliers, analyze it, put it into a spreadsheet, you decide whether you're compliant or not, create certificates. Like all that is chaotic at best, when you're trying to manage it all at scale, especially. And even if you might have a great internal compliance team, supplier engagement appears to be certainly one big bottleneck. One other challenge we have seen, especially in Certivo, as we deal with a lot of suppliers, is supplier engagement remains one of the big bottlenecks here. Suppliers are often slow to respond to PFAS information requests, language barriers, lack of regulatory knowledge, create friction, especially in global sourcing. You folks are coming to this webinar, listening, learning, etc., preparing for the deadlines going into 25 and 26. A lot of suppliers just don't know, right? They're not sitting here and trying to understand what the PFAS laws are in California or something like that. And so, that's, I think, another issue. Education is certainly a big issue. Some suppliers may fear disclosure will make their products undesirable, leading to evasive or incomplete answers. So they might, intentionally say, well, I don't want to, disclose something. Yeah, and compliance teams are left manually chasing these responses, right? Burning hundreds of hours for little progress. And so that's why these traditional sort of compliance methods like spreadsheets, email blasts, etc., are failing in this PFAS era, especially because of the scale that is required to manage it all. So let's put some numbers behind this. You manage bill of materials with 10,000 parts. You need to collect PFAS declarations from just 2 suppliers. You're looking at 20,000 individual data requests. And now factor in non-responses, follow-ups, reformatting messy data. Essentially, it's simply unmanageable, manually. So companies trying to use spreadsheets, email inboxes to manage this volume are setting themselves, in my view, up for fail. And that's why, in my view, the future of compliance requires automation, requires supplier collaboration platforms, and AI-assisted analysis. So let's talk about some best practices here. The first and best practice, I think, is simple, but it's powerful. Maybe all of you are already doing it, but if not, build a full parts and supply inventory. Make sure you get control of, look, what are all the bill of materials that I need to really keep track of. So start with your bill of materials, complete current links to all your supplier IDs, map out which parts and materials have potential PFAS exposure, prioritize any high risk products, textiles, electronics, medical devices, essentially for early supplier outreach. Don't stop at tier 1. You must push upstream to tier 2, tier 3 if possible as well, because the hidden PFAS risks often lurk 2 or 3 layers deep. So essentially, if you don't have it fully mapped out, you're flying blind. So that's my sort of at least approach we take with our clients at Certivo as well. Is like, hey, let's get all your inventory essentially into our platform, and let's make sure that we have a full map of all your bill of materials, the different parts. Let's map them to all your vendors and just get a sense end to end of what that looks like. Engage suppliers early is what I would say as step 2. Launch structured supplier outreach campaigns. Don't wait until the deadline comes. July 2025. Like, start now. Use standardized disclosure templates, asking for clear yes/no answers on PFAS presence, or request certificates of compliance directly. Track responses systematically, know who responded, who refused, and who hasn't answered. Escalate any non-responses, because missing supplier data is essentially regulatory risk for you. So supplier engagement isn't sort of like a one-time email; it's a campaign. In at least that's what we call it. It's a system. It's a core compliance operation, right? And that has to happen essentially now. So launching these structured outreach campaigns, in my view, are also a very important, and the follow-ups to them on a regular basis are going to be very important, because you have to essentially collect all the disclosures from your suppliers. Third, automation and dynamic monitoring, in my view, are essential. If you can automate some of your supply outreach, reminders, document collection, I think that's another key piece. Centralize all your documentation, the certificates of compliance, supplier declarations, regulatory notes in some sort of searchable dynamic system. A lot of clients we see sometimes, we have one client that they have everything all around the place. They've got it in different systems. They've got handwritten notes, and all good, valuable data, but not centralized into a simple system, into a straightforward system that can be searchable, etc. So I think that's another piece, is centralizing and collecting all your data into a single centralized system is going to be important. Monitor global PFAS regulations in real time. Rules are changing, monthly across jurisdictions. Build dashboards, that map compliance risks across your bill of materials, not just, static risk reports. So everything has to be very dynamic in nature. And of course, tools like Certivo can help, but outside of that, even if you do it within a spreadsheet or you build your own dashboard, etc., everything has to be sort of dynamic in nature, because things are changing so fast and it's a little chaotic out there right now, just given, there's just so many things that are moving very quickly. So in my view, companies who automate, they centralize today, are the ones, who can stay compliant and competitive, tomorrow. I'm going to keep repeating my standard, complaint against spreadsheets and emails. In small, simple organizations, these can work temporarily, but under PFAS compliance, managing thousands of parts and suppliers, they essentially collapse. Manual data entry, errors multiply, there's no version control, so data becomes outdated almost immediately. Tracking thousands of supplier responses manually becomes logistically impossible. Missed updates, missed reporting deadlines, non-compliance risk. Spreadsheets were never designed for dynamic, regulatory-driven, multi-jurisdictional compliance workflows, and essentially they, break under the PFAS pressures. And the reason I keep saying this is because I've seen so many folks out there still, using sort of the more old school method, and as it expands over time, it starts sort of breaking down very easily, and especially with PFAS, which is not sort of one regulatory framework. It's multiple regulatory frameworks that are statewide, but more importantly, the number of chemicals, the number of groups to be tracked are just significant in amount. We're dealing with 10,000 plus sort of chemicals here. So things for us to just keep in mind. Some companies have tried some basic supplier portals. Suppliers can log in, upload documents. A problem with them is the static portals passively wait for suppliers to act. They don't chase or engage suppliers automatically. They provide little to no visibility into non-responses or incomplete data. There's no built-in logic to escalate slow suppliers. So they rarely map back incoming data back to your BOM risk dynamically. So, you can imagine you essentially tell a supplier, hey, here's my portal, please upload your documents. The probability that they're going to do it is close to low. So there's no chasing down, of the suppliers. There's no mapping of what they send you back directly into your bill of materials, into the right parts. All that, again, has to be done manually. So unless the system is end-to-end connected to bill of materials, to parts, to PFAS, to your supplier, to the right IDs, there's sort of a broken link, and it involves a lot of manual effort. So static portals are not bad. They still capture some data, but they don't drive the kind of supplier behavior that we all want. They don't clean the data. They don't give you the real compliance readiness that we're looking for. Finally, the most expensive mistake isn't trying a system that's too basic. It's doing nothing. Missed reporting deadlines, again, can't repeat this enough, can trigger 6 or 7-figure fines. You can lose major OEM customers who demand full PFAS declaration for substances or from suppliers. Brand reputation can take a massive hit if regulatory non-compliance becomes public. Worst of all, emergency compliance projects, when you're already under investigation, typically cost 5 to 10 times more than proactive compliance planning. The real risk isn't in buying new compliance tools. The real risk is in doing nothing and getting caught unprepared. So the future of compliance, and wanted to cover a little bit of this in this webinar, is to not just portray where PFAS is, but also where the future of compliance is across the industry, and how we see, at least at Certivo, where AI is helping manage a lot of this process today. Today, most compliance workflows are reactive. You find out about regulatory changes late. You scramble to update supplier documentation. You hope nothing critical was missed. But the future, honestly, is the present need that demands proactive compliance. Systems must monitor regulatory changes automatically, period. If you can't monitor all these deadlines that are upcoming and how well you're prepared towards those deadlines, essentially the system is broken. BOM risks must be flagged in real time. The system must be able to say, look, I've analyzed your BOM and you're not meeting this particular deadline or not. Supply engagement must start early, not after a violation, or not once a deadline has been hit. Compliance status must be dynamic, not static. You might be compliant today, but you might be out of compliance, a month or 2 months from now. So companies that survive and thrive will be the ones who move their compliance upstream, who detect issues early and who fix them before this becomes a crisis. And the real breakthrough isn't just in tracking. In my view, it's automation. So imagine supplier PFAS declaration surveys going out automatically. Reminders triggered automatically for suppliers who don't respond. Responses that come back from suppliers linked directly to BOM parts. the risk scoring for those suppliers are automatically updated dynamically. Compliance dashboards updated instantly, not just weeks later. This is not science fiction. It sounds like it is, but it's available today, and many companies are leading and handling PFAS at scale. And the role of AI that's playing, that's transforming compliance from overwhelming a operational burden into strategic. You can imagine what AI can do today. It can scan thousands of regulatory updates and supplier documents. It can flag inconsistencies like suppliers missing key certifications or declaring risky materials. It can predict future risks, suggesting which parts may become non-compliant based on proposed laws. It can even translate supplier communication in real time across multiple languages. AI isn't replacing compliance professionals. I think that's the big takeaway here. I think a lot of folks sometimes feel, oh, AI is going to take my job away. That is 100% not true. AI isn't taking anyone's job away. It's supercharging them. And that's my view. It's supercharging you, giving you breadth. It's giving you speed. It's giving you strategic foresight that no human team could match alone. And I think that's a very critical takeaway. I always tell myself, in my job, I, as the CEO of Certivo, have become a lot more effective because I use AI in my day-to-day. I prepare emails using ChatGPT. And so the question is, where's the ChatGPT for the compliance folks? What's superpowering them? What's supercharging them and giving them wings so that they can do their job a lot more effectively and hit all those deadlines that we talked about effectively? And this modern compliance is really, in my view, a competitive edge that companies should lean into. Companies who modernize their compliance, moving to more proactive, automated, AI-assisted systems, are already seeing massive competitive advantages. I tell you that, with our clients, again, that we work with. They get their products to market faster without regulatory delays. They become preferred suppliers for major OEMs who demand PFAS transparency. They lower legal and audit risks by reducing risk. They strengthen their ESG positioning, winning customers and investors who value sustainability and compliance excellence. And so compliance isn't just about avoiding fines. It's about winning. It's about market leadership. It's about growth. And that's really, why, we created Certivo, and Certivo sort of manages this entire process, for companies end to end. So for those on the call, we are about 9 minutes away, but I wanted to maybe stop here and end. But hopefully this gives you a big picture overview on everything, PFAS, all the upcoming deadlines, some sort of tips and tricks on how you should start engaging early, and, maybe using more proactive systems like Certivo, in my view, to essentially sort of manage this entire process for you. Folks who have already started are certainly seeing the results, and we're working very closely, with some of them. But yeah, I really enjoyed, speaking to all of you about this. But let me stop here and see if anyone on the call has any questions. Otherwise, I'll stop sharing. I have no idea how to stop sharing this. Oh, there you go. Great. Okay. Any questions for anyone on the call? If not, that's okay. We'll wrap up. I will send you this deck. That way you have all the deadlines. You've got some of this information as well. That you can keep with you. I know some of you on the call, Sabrina, we work together, so we'll certainly we'll keep following up offline as well. During our meetings. So, and we'll talk about sort of reporting, etc., and how we're gonna sort of track towards those. But and anyone again hearing this, if you certainly go to certivo.com and check us out there and learn more about what we have to offer and how we can help companies manage this entire process for you using a AI assisted approach. Okay, I'll let everyone go. Thank you again. If there are no questions, and then yeah, we'll certainly touch base offline.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.